this idea that society actually doesn't mind losing certain people.
Society, as it is organized now, produces what Walter Mignolo has called dispensable, bare lives. Lives that society can do without.
Visibility of disability, right, which is recognizing and celebrating the lived experiences of everyone.
We live in a very ableist society, and a non-disabled person myself, there's always this inherent assumption, which is the norm.
I want to start with that quote, and I want you all to keep it in mind. The question that Judith Butler asks is, what qualifies as bodies that matter, ways of living that count as life, lives worth saving, and lives worth grieving? And I do want to also put a quick disclaimer. When I do use terms like disability or persons with disability or disabled, I'm using it as a socio-political category. Obviously, it's not a uniform experience. I mean, you get mental, sensory, physical, and emotional disabilities. So I don't want to speak on behalf of all of this. It's just as a means to ease the conversation.
You know, I find that quote from Judith Butler just so poignant and so profound. This idea that society actually doesn't mind losing certain people because they're probably just seen as too much trouble, too expensive, and just not really worth it. But it also makes me think about how easily questions around disability are dismissed or just out of consciousness, and the importance for us to become a lot more mindful in the way in which we address the humanity of disabled people, which links to the previous conversation that we had. And I think particularly within academia, it's always quite shocking to me how disability is like the last issue to come onto the radar and the first one to fall off it. And I think that that's something that we all need to take responsibility for.
Yeah. Definitely. Melissa, the systemic and structural way in which society, as it is organized now, at a world scale, produces what Walter Mignolo has called dispensable, bare lives. Lives that society can do without or can relegate to the peripheries and all that. And it appears to me that this is linked to capitalism and its obsession with the productivity and production, whereby people with bodies that cannot perform certain tasks for whatever reason, people with organs that cannot carry out certain efforts, are then disqualified from mainstream life as unable, as disabled. Therefore, they are objects of charity, objects of pity, and even subjects of our contempt. We come up with all sorts of explanations why they are like that. Some people will religiously say it's a curse. Others will say something wrong was done in the family, and all other excuses. But these are excuses for recognizing other human beings as part of the common familyhood of human beings, only with different abilities and capacities. Yeah, but I think it comes from our systemic and structural obsession with productivity, with products, tasks, performances, and all that. And I like it that the communicator in the beginning did say that this is a wide spectrum mental, some of it invisible, some of it quite metaphysical, in that one cannot explain it at a sitting, that this person has this incapacity, this person has this disability. And I thank you, Melissa, for highlighting that scholarship should really start paying more attention, more investment in this category of human difference.
William, if I can I'm going to just quickly interject. What you're saying, I think, in essence, is that disability is part of a normal society. You know, and I think that that's an important mind shift, you know, because it gets constructed as abnormal and therefore, as you said, dispensable, but it's part of a normal society.
Yes.
Which I think is a very important way for us to approach these issues.
Yes.
It is, Melissa, it is part of a normal society, but there's also something that comes for me there to what we need to think about is to recognize that disability is part of a normal society. But in that, also recognizing that people with disabilities go through certain lived experiences, right? They need a little bit of care, right? They need a little bit of understanding, which takes me back to what William was saying when he says, you know, there's capitalism in there, where, you know, if this body cannot produce, you know, cannot be helpful economically, then, you know, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And what you also mentioned to say that, you know, if society doesn't want a burden, you know, to use that in quotes, right? And in some instances, it even gets to the case where, you know, lives of people with disabilities are then seen as, you know, if it's a burden, then why not to use words from Shirley Tremaine, who we once had, you know, in our conference, where she says, you know, they looked at as lives that can be gotten rid of, right? That are preferably, if we can eliminate them, you know, and do without them, right? And what does that mean, you know, about in cases where women who are pregnant, right, and expecting children, who they may know, you know, have disabilities, right? Of course, not taking away their agency to be able to be given that choice, right?
Yes,
to be able to abort that baby if they wanted to. But, you know, when it gets to the point where women with carrying children who have disabilities, right, get to the point where all those babies need to be aborted, right? What does that mean? You know, if disability is something that we should get rid of, because, you know, once it's here, it's going to be a burden. So everyone who's carrying a child with disability, it must be aborted, right, before it even gets to come out and be a burden for the rest of society.
Right.
And Rudo, you mentioned something which I find very profound, particularly the agency of people living with disabilities, and how as a society we to some degree socialized into taking away their agency. And I'm thinking particularly in regard to the question of how we attribute asexuality or hypersexuality to people living with disability. And I think it also connects to the point that you raise, where apart from seeing people living with disabilities as potentially hypersexual people, that there's also this inherent fear that if someone living with a disability were to have give birth to a child, there's always the fear that they would produce another child with a disability. Particularly, I see it in our indigenous Zimbabwean society when it comes to albinism, for example. This idea that there's a higher chance of having a child with albinism. So, and also the question of their sexual agency, that as a society, we consider people living with disabilities as sort of not interested or not capable of having sexual relationships, courtship, and normal social pleasure relationships. And I think speaking to that, back to that point, that ties together for me the question of grievable lives? Do we see people living with disabilities as a loss to society if something were to happen to them, or that it's a favor to society if something does?
That's right. And in fact, from everything that we've said, it sounds to me sort of that society's attitude towards people living with disabilities is that of a grudge. Like society begrudges whatever is needed for people with disabilities, even their existence is granted begrudgingly. Yeah.
Exactly. And Melissa, this comes to the whole idea of criminalization of difference, blaming people for their being different. And it's not only in scholarship that this category of human difference is not capitalized, is not invested in. Even in policy making, national budgets, and societal recognition and concern, whereby then these people with certain incapacities, certain impairments, certain inabilities are criminalized and systemically and structurally punished.
Yes.
For being themselves. And the punishment might not always come in victimization, but also even in the way resources are allocated to them, to their living conditions, the accesses that are given to them, and the consideration that they are given in the infrastructure, buildings, learning processes, and everywhere. It's the last thing to be remembered that in this gathering, in this party, in this lecture, in this rally, how are people using chairs going to come in? How are people with visual challenges going to look at this? How are people with hearing challenges going? It's the last thought to be recognized in all what we do. So,
William, I think your point you've raised is an interesting segue into the next clip that I believe we're going to be watching.
When I think about what happens in the scenario, if you think about what it happens just like within a supermarket, usually some places or shops are not accessible. So sometimes you crosses your mind that do they not think that people with disabilities want to go shopping, or do they not want to buy certain goods, etc.? So I think seeing the fact that a deaf person is employed is like an amazing step forward, and things are only going to change when there's more visibility of disability.
Wow, I mean, watching that clip is a bit painful, and hearing what Paul is saying there. But I just want to pick up on what he says about visibility of disability, right, which is recognizing and celebrating the lived experiences of everyone, right? Looking at the actual lived experiences of people with disabilities, right? In doing this, right, we need to be able to recognize that people with disabilities, right, engage in most, or even all, depending on the disability, most or all of the social activities that non-disabled people engage in, right? But when they do engage in these activities, right, do they have enough access, right? Are they going to be able to properly engage in these activities and be fully involved and get the same experience that a non-disabled person would be getting from engaging in that particular experience, right? I can maybe just take this home and think of the times that I've been in antenatal classes.
Yeah,
right? Antenatal classes are for pregnant women who are expecting babies, obviously. You go for antenatal classes and they're teaching you about different things. I've noticed, I've been there twice, but in both the times, there wasn't a sign language interpreter when I went to these antenatal classes. So what does that mean? Does that mean that deaf women are not having children, right? They're not being considered. They're not being thought of whoever's arranging these antenatal classes, they're arranging antenatal classes. Are women with hearing disabilities not being considered? Are they not being thought of as also attending these classes, right? Which takes us back to what Kudzai said in when we watched that previous clip, to say, right, are we not taking away the rights of people with disabilities to also be able to engage in sexual experiences, to be able to engage in reproduction, right? Are we not taking away that when we are going to these antenatal classes and there's not even an option for someone who's not hearing?
Yeah. And Rudo, I think one of the undisputable facts that comes from what you're saying is we live in a very ableist society. And as a non-disabled person myself, there's always this inherent assumption, which is the norm, that you're dealing with, or you're thinking about this kind of body. For example, when William talks about structures and town planning, for example, or if you're building or constructing certain buildings and you're not putting ramps, you don't have in mind a certain kind of a body that doesn't look like the sort of normative or normalized sort of fully functional body. And I think that also takes us to the point of the disabling consequences of the decisions that non-disabled people, who are most likely to be in influential positions of policy making, who are most likely to be in influential positions in any kind of sort of social strata or social structures that we can think of. Then I think the other question that emanates from Paul's conversation is also the thinking around what kind of social change should be thought through in regard of inclusion, so that in every kind of decision, in any kind of sort of policy or policy making, you do have people living with disabilities engaged in those conversations, because I think their absence leads to this ordinariness of able-bodied people, which is ableism. And I think to some degree, most able-bodied people are ableist, and it just comes to us later that, oh, like you said, Melissa, disability is an afterthought. Yeah.
Yes, Kudzai, thank you very much for invoking the systemic and structural issue about disability. I want us to look at the coloniality of disability in its systemic and structural genealogy. Conquest itself was a disabling event, because before you colonize the native, before you dominate the native, you identify deficits, you identify lacks, you identify inabilities in that native. Then you can get into their land, civilize them, modernize them as the conqueror, as the one that is able, as the one that does not have the deficits and the lacks. Before, women are marginalized from employment, from life opportunities, and from other categories of mainstream life. Society systemically and structurally identifies lacks, deficits, wants, and inabilities. Before, the elderly are peripherized in society from the economy, from the polity and everything. We must identify lacks, deficits, inabilities, and incapacities. So this disability is systemic and structural in that way, in which you are not here disabled, but you get disabled by the systems and the structures that we sort of operate with, that we sort of live with.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about what you're saying there is that when you say identify lacks, it's more constructing lacks, because you don't actually, like women are regarded or have been regarded as, say, too emotional to be taken seriously. It's not that there really is a lack there. It's that it suits the dominant group to construct that as a lack. In this case, so-called emotionality. But it's about decisions. It's about decisions society makes. And so I'm actually tempted to tell a story from my own personal experience, just the way with COVID-19, when obviously there were issues around resources and the availability of things like ventilators and hospital beds, and decisions were made to say that if you're over 65, you should in some way back off for younger people. And that for me was actually because I had COVID, I was very ill. And it was quite a thought that suddenly my life has become worth less than other lives, especially since I still felt I had a hell of a lot I wanted to do,
Yeah.
And I think that's really an illustration of how it's a decision. I mean, who says 65, who says 60, who says 70? These are in a way almost arbitrary, social ideas of what constitutes the end of a productive, to get back to what you said, a productive life, and a life that's going to be economically viable, to use that kind of language. But it also, I think, links to the whole question of categorization, which I know, Kudzaiishe, you feel quite strongly about.
Yeah. And thanks, Melissa, for sharing your experiences. That's very close to home. Categorization. I think, like you did mention, I do feel that we can't think about any form of sort of marginalization separate from other ways that people continue to be categorized. And William, you spoke to the reality of the colonial project as being one of categorization, the creation of certain lesser beings, and how society constructs these different sort of identities. But before we look into the next clip, I also just want to speak back to maybe the use of the term inabilities, because I know that the community of people living with disabilities always have the slogan that disability does not mean inability, and that nothing about them should be done without them, or any conversation without them. And I think we do need future conversations where we actually do continue to engage with the community, and also not necessarily frame disability as inability. But I think we'll have more reflections on these parts after watching the next clip.
For me, I'm sorry, I've never worked in shops. But yes, the experiences that deaf people had, they told me a lot of times, and we share things, and they are very emotional. It's difficult for deaf people to work. Hearing people are always asking them questions or shouting at them, but they don't feel okay. They don't even, most of the time, last at the jobs that they're doing. And then their bosses also must learn sign language so that they can have at least basic signs, but they don't. And they should be learning sign language. Because deaf people feel lonely. How are they communicating with other people? And maybe you hired one person. Sometimes staff members also treat them bad. And then maybe, let's say it's lunchtime or break time, you find a deaf person seated alone and they don't have anybody to communicate with. That's also, it's a bad treatment still, even if they don't do anything physically to a person.
So on the same thread of categories, and I think we could also call it border drawing, sort of the demarcations that ableism and also other systems of difference implement in community and in existence. I think one thing that comes out for me there is the question of sort of community building and community making, and how, as I alluded to previously, that ableism is a very it's a very normative system, and we barely sort of see how we're participating in it. As speaking for myself as a non-disabled person, and here the interesting thing that John says for me is around how, without necessarily saying anything to a person living with a disability, the feeling of exclusion is inherent. And I think that speaks to complicity. And there's always this assumption that we have that you have to sort of actively, whatever that means, participate in excluding certain people for you to be considered ableist. But I mean, in terms of relationality, if someone who's working as a teller and they're deaf cannot have someone to talk to, and then this experience of feeling lonely, I think that sort of keeps the whole system together, but it also speaks to sort of like the actual experiences and the fabric of how someone who's living with a disability would feel. And I think that also goes beyond mere theory to sort of saying this is an everyday reality for people that are living with disabilities, and we really need to take that into consideration. Yeah.
Totally, Kudzai. I think you're totally right. There is that aspect of social isolation that comes there, right? When somebody cannot sit with anyone during lunchtime because nobody bothers to learn sign language, and nobody makes it an important issue, right? We can talk of here in South Africa, where sign language was only made an official language in July 2023, right? And in the world, there's only, I think, about 40 or 41 countries that have sign language as an official language, right? So, what is society saying? That is it not important to be able to learn how to communicate with people with disabilities, right? Does it not matter if we don't have a conversation with people with disabilities? Does it, as long as, like, for example, like what John says there, that, the bosses also need to make an effort, right? For the boss, right? Are they saying as long as this person is working here, being productive, goes back to the capitalism that William was talking about. As long as we get what we want out of them, right, everything else doesn't matter. Their social well-being doesn't matter. Who they sit with at lunchtime, doesn't matter. If people can communicate with them, doesn't matter.
This conversation about exclusion is making me think again about the quotation from Judith Butler that we started off with, because to me, it's like a continuum. Exclusion from the workplace, exclusion from communication, but that it's not such a huge leap to exclusion from life.
Yeah.
And I think that's again comes back, as I'm saying, to the grievable lives. It's just like who can we actually sort of feel comfortable with excluding from life? And that makes me think of another big issue, which is the whole question of assisted suicide. And I've always been quite clear in my own mind that the progressive position is to say, yes, this is a good thing. A person must be able to choose when they want to end their lives if they're suffering. But it does make me question, if there's this tacit assumption around you that actually your life is not worth living and that actually you should go away, how do we know what it means to actually be choosing that you don't feel that your life is worth going on with?
Yeah.
If you are a person with a disability, if it's been communicated to you in all sorts of these subtle social ways that actually your life isn't worth it.
Yeah.
So I'm beginning to wonder if that actually does mean that we need to be quite cautious around assisted suicide when it comes to people with disabilities.
Okay. Yeah. Without overloading theory, Melissa, I really want to go back to the coloniality of ableism that Kudzaiishe is talking about, and the constructivist systems and structures around it. There was a time where the black skin was a disability that justified
Right.
conquest and domination. there's a systemic and structural way in which being foreign nationals will appear as disabled people who cannot speak our language, who do not look like us, and who come from strange geographies. And age. Young people get peripherized on the grounds of their being leaders of tomorrow, people that are postponed for another day. The same with the elderly that are dismissed from decision-making, from functioning professionally and otherwise on the basis of that they are beyond the constructed and the decided age of their involvement and all that. So there is a continuous systemic and structural disabling machinery and technologies that take place everywhere. And it always happens when other people have to be excluded from resources, opportunities, and all that. Look at how non-gender conforming people, the queer people, are societally, systemically, and structurally disabled. Their sexuality is strange, their gender is strange, and therefore, kids must be protected from them. We must do something about them in the workplace. We must do something about them in every sector of productive and meaningful life and all that. All that is the working of the coloniality of ableism as an opportunity to exclude and peripherize other people from mainstream life and all that. And it should really worry us, like what Melissa is saying.
Yeah, and mainstream life, but in the end from life.
Yeah. And I think quickly, it's another thing to be wholly excluded, to be ostracized and placed at a sort of a distant island, but to be sort of excluded, sort of exclusion by inclusion, where you're actually seen to be participating, you're given a job, you as a person living with a disability, you are there to fill a diversity metric, so you are seen in this whole framework of capital, that the presence of disabled life in a particular company is representative of how well it's doing with diversity, but not necessarily to change the structural arrangements to make the workplace a livable place for people living with disabilities, or community as a whole, society, the world as a whole. I think that's, for me, like the pitfall of neoliberalism, that there are certain kinds or certain people with disabilities that will be very much visible, but their experiences, like you spoke to, Melissa, are those that could potentially drive one to self-immolation and self-destruction. And I think that's also for me, very sad. And I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, but I'm quite happy with the conversation we've had. And I think it's also quite a reflective one based on our positionalities and the work that we do. And I hope we can talk more about disability in upcoming conversations.
It's a conversation to be continued.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everybody would define themselves in a good way that is, but when people know you, they will say, yes, you are African, but you're not the stereotypical African that we know.
Many white South Africans particularly would want to shrug off that past.
There's something I find almost offensive when white people use words like carry the burden of the past,
totally.
Because like you are not the one carrying any burden. Like being privileged, being born into privilege, that is not a burden.